Wrongfully convicted cop begs to see his K9 one last time. What happens next is unbelievable. The courtroom was suffocating with silence, the kind that pressed against the chest like a lead weight. Ethan Hayes, a decorated officer with years of dedicated service, stood rigid in the defendant's chair, his jaw locked and his hands clenched into fists on the table before him. His uniform, once a symbol of honor, had been stripped from him. Instead, he wore the dull, lifeless suit his lawyer had insisted would make him look more sympathetic to the jury. It didn't seem to matter. Their faces, hardened with quiet judgment, were set. His fate had already been decided long before today. Juno, his loyal K9 partner, sat at the edge of the courtroom near the bailiff, her posture stiff, ears perked. The German shepherd was restless, glancing between Ethan and the judge as if she could sense that something was terribly wrong. The bond they shared was stronger than words, forged in countless missions, each one reinforcing the unspoken trust between them. But today, Juno could do nothing but watch. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Meredith Shaw, stood with a victorious air as she delivered her closing statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate, "this man, Officer Ethan Hayes, was sworn to uphold the law. Instead, he betrayed it. The evidence is clear: tampered reports, missing narcotics from the evidence room, and, worst of all, a planted firearm that led to an innocent man being convicted. This is not just a mistake. This was calculated, a betrayal of the very badge he once wore with pride. We ask you to deliver justice." Ethan's lawyer, Thomas Grady, pushed back his chair and rose, his expression weary but determined. "Your Honor, members of the jury, I ask you to consider who Ethan Hayes is: a decorated officer, a man who put his life on the line for the city. Look at the facts. The timeline of this so-called evidence does not hold up. The key witness recanted. And most importantly, ask yourselves, who stands to gain from this? Ethan Hayes had nothing to gain, but someone else did. Someone who wanted him out of the way. Do not let a good man be the scapegoat for a system that is protecting its own secrets." The judge, an older man with deep lines on his face from years of delivering justice, exhaled heavily before turning to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard both arguments. It is now time for you to deliberate." The jury filed out, their expressions unreadable. The air inside the courtroom remained thick with tension, the collective breath of the audience held in anticipation. Ethan lowered his head, his mind racing. He had spent weeks trying to understand how this had happened, how his career, his reputation, his life had been shattered in an instant. The only thing that kept him anchored was Juno. Even now, she sat as still as a statue, her brown eyes locked onto him, unwavering in her silent support. Minutes turned to an hour, then two. The murmurs of the courtroom barely registered as Ethan's mind cycled through every moment leading up to his arrest. He had trusted Captain Lawson, his mentor, a man he had once admired above all others. Lawson had testified against him, his words delivered with the same steady authority that had once made him a respected leader in the force. That betrayal had stung deeper than anything. Ethan had felt it in his bones. The jury returned. The bailiff called the room to order, and the judge asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a woman with sharp features and no emotion in her gaze, stood. "We have, Your Honor." Ethan barely breathed as she unfolded the paper in her hands. "On the charge of evidence tampering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendant guilty." The words hit him like a blow. There was no time to process them before the judge nodded, his voice grave. "Officer Hayes, the court hereby sentences you to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. For the first 10, this court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel striking the wood was drowned out by the roaring in Ethan's ears. He barely registered the crowd, the shifting bodies, the gasps, the quiet murmurs. His body remained stiff, unmovable, his mind detached from the weight of his fate. He had seen men react in every way imaginable in courtrooms before: rage, breakdowns, pleas for mercy. But he gave them nothing, only silence. Juno barked suddenly, sharp and urgent. The courtroom flinched at the sound, and the bailiff tugged on her leash. But Juno refused to move. Ethan turned his head slowly, locking eyes with his partner. She knew. Somehow, she knew this wasn't right. His chest tightened at the sight of her struggling, her paws digging into the floor to resist being taken away. "Wait," he said, his voice hoarse. The judge had already left, but he looked to the bailiff. "Please, let me say goodbye." The bailiff hesitated before looking to the officer escorting Ethan. A nod was given, and Juno was allowed to approach. She bounded forward and pressed herself against him, her weight firm, her warmth grounding him. Ethan knelt down, burying his fingers in her thick fur. "You take care of yourself, girl," he murmured, his voice breaking. Juno whined softly, then did something strange. She pulled at the hem of his jacket with her teeth, persistent and urgent. Hey," he said, frowning. She yanked again, this time pulling loose a small object hidden beneath his chair. A tiny recording device. The room seemed to tilt. Ethan reached for it, his mind catching up with what Juno had found. The bailiff stepped in, snatching it before he could, frowning as he turned it over in his hand. The device was sleek, barely noticeable. Something someone could have easily hidden beneath a chair without anyone being the wiser. "Where did this come from?" the bailiff muttered, glancing around. Ethan felt his pulse hammer in his skull. His eyes lifted, scanning the courtroom, landing on Captain Lawson. The older man's face had gone pale, his posture suddenly rigid. It was only a flicker, a moment of hesitation, but Ethan saw it. Juno had just found something someone didn't want them to. Ethan slowly stood, ignoring the chains on his wrists, his gaze never leaving Lawson. The pieces were rearranging themselves in his mind, the puzzle no longer fragmented but forming into something undeniable. He had been framed, and now, thanks to Juno, he had proof. The holding cell was cold, the kind of cold that crept into the bones and refused to leave. Ethan sat on the stiff metal bench, his wrists still sore from the tightness of the cuffs they had only just removed. His mind was a storm, thoughts clashing and tumbling over one another as he replayed the moment in the courtroom. Juno's strange behavior, the recording device, Lawson's fleeting look of panic. He had seen it, that flicker of fear in his former mentor's eyes. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was certainty, but certainty alone wouldn't save him. He needed that recording. He needed to hear what was on it. More importantly, he needed someone on the outside to help him. And there was only one person he could trust: Natalie Carter. Natalie had been his partner before his arrest, one of the few people in the department who hadn't turned their back on him when the allegations surfaced, even when the evidence mounted against him, even when others whispered behind her back for still believing in him. She hadn't wavered. She had visited him in the early days of his arrest, promising to look into the case. But when the trial date was set, she had gone silent. He never blamed her. The pressure to stay away from a convicted officer must have been unbearable. Yet, if anyone could help him now, it was her. The sound of boots against concrete pulled him from his thoughts. A guard stopped in front of his cell, a neutral expression on his face. "You've got a visitor," the man said before unlocking the door and motioning for Ethan to follow. His heart pounded as he stepped out. This could be a trap, some ploy to make sure he never got the chance to expose what he knew. But as he was led into the small visitation room and saw who was waiting for him, he felt a rare flicker of hope. Natalie sat at the table, arms crossed, her brown eyes sharp with the kind of determination that meant she already knew something was wrong. "You look like hell," she said as soon as he sat across from her. "Feels about right," he muttered. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "But then I saw something I couldn't ignore." Ethan leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "The recording device." Natalie nodded. "I have it." A slow breath left Ethan's lips. That meant the bailiff hadn't turned it over to the prosecution. Maybe Juno's discovery had thrown them off enough to make them hesitate. "Have you listened to it?" he asked. She pulled a small plastic evidence bag from her pocket, setting it carefully on the table between them. "Not yet. I wanted you to be the first to hear it." Ethan glanced at the guard in the corner, then back at Natalie. "You brought it here?" "Relax," she said. "I made a copy. This is the original, and right now, I'm the only one who knows where the copy is." Despite the situation, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. Still the best damn detective I know. Don't flatter me. You're still in a lot of trouble, she shot back, but there was something in her expression. A fire he hadn't seen in a long time. She wanted to fight, and she was on his side. She pulled out a small audio device and plugged in an earpiece. Ethan watched as she inserted the recording chip, pressed play, and listened. For a long moment, her face was unreadable. Then her expression changed. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes widened just a fraction, and her fingers curled around the edge of the table as if holding herself in place. When she finally looked at Ethan, there was something raw in her eyes, shock, anger, and something deeper. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice almost hoarse. "They set you up." The words sent a shiver down his spine, even though he had already known it deep in his gut. "Who's on the recording?" Natalie exhaled slowly. "Lawson and Shaw." Ethan stiffened. "The prosecutor?" Natalie nodded grimly. "She's in on it. They were talking about how they planted the gun in your locker, how they doctored the reports. There was mention of a bigger player, but they didn't say a name. Just that he wanted you out of the way." Ethan clenched his jaw. "That has to be Harrington." "Senator Harrington," Natalie frowned. "Why would a politician care about you?" "I don't know yet," Ethan admitted, "but I intend to find out." Natalie tapped her fingers on the table, thinking, "This recording is enough to get your case reopened, but it's not enough to take them all down. If we move too soon, they'll bury this evidence before we can even get a judge to hear it. We need more." Ethan hated that she was right. Exposing Lawson and Shaw would only be the first step. If Harrington was truly behind this, then they had to find the connection between him and the department's corruption. But first, they needed to get Ethan out of prison. "How soon can you file the appeal?" he asked. "I'll take this to Grady," she said. "With this evidence, he can push for an emergency hearing. If the judge agrees, you could be out within a week." "A week is a long time when you've got people trying to make sure you never talk," Ethan said darkly. Natalie's expression hardened. "I'll keep Juno with me. If something happens to you, she'll lead me to the rest of the truth." Ethan's chest tightened at the thought of Juno being out of his reach, but he knew she'd be safer with Natalie. "Take care of her," he said. "I will," Natalie promised, standing up. "Stay alive, Ethan. This isn't over." The guard escorted him back to his cell, but something had shifted inside him. Before, he had been a man sentenced, a man stripped of control over his own life. But now there was hope. Now he had an opening. As he lay on the cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, he didn't think about the bars or the walls or the guards who walked past his cell. He thought about what came next. A week. If he could survive that long, he was going to make sure every last person who had done this to him paid for it. The hum of fluorescent lights in the prison hallway was a constant, a low electric buzz that never ceased, never wavered. Ethan had spent 3 days in this cell since Natalie had brought him the truth, and every second had stretched longer than the last. He had always thought of himself as a man with patience, the kind of cop who could wait out a suspect's nervous silence, who could sit through endless stakeouts without so much as a sigh of frustration. But this was different. This wasn't the patience of a hunter. This was the patience of a man waiting to see if the world would decide he was worth saving. Every footstep beyond the bars sent his pulse spiking. Every guard that stopped just a moment to long outside his cell made his body tense. In preparation for the worst, he knew he wasn't safe here. The moment the recording had been recovered, the countdown to his elimination had started ticking. He had been a fool to think they'd simply let him wait for his appeal. Lawson and Shaw had buried him once, and now that the cracks were showing in their deception, they wouldn't hesitate to make sure he never made it out of this place alive. Ethan sat on the edge of his cot, fingers curled into fists against his knees, his mind running through every possible angle. His lawyer had filed the appeal, that much he was sure of, but the legal system moved at a crawl, and he didn't have time for the slow wheels of justice to turn in his favor. He needed a way out before someone made sure he never saw the inside of a courtroom again. The guards wouldn't help him. Half of them were probably on Lawson's payroll, and the other half didn't care what happened to a disgraced cop. He had no allies inside these walls, no one except himself, and maybe Juno, wherever she was. The thought of his partner sent a sharp pang through his chest. He had always felt invincible with her by his side, like nothing could touch him as long as she was there. But she wasn't, and he had never felt more alone. The sound of the lock clicking on his cell door sent him rocketing to his feet. Before he could even process the movement, the guard that stepped inside wasn't one he recognized, which immediately put him on edge. The man was stocky, thick-necked, and had the look of someone who enjoyed his job a little too much. His name tag read Foster, and Ethan saw the faintest hint of amusement curling at the man's lips as he gestured with his baton. "You've got a new cell assignment, Hayes," he said. "Orders from up top." Ethan's gut twisted. Orders from up top. That could only mean one thing. He was being moved somewhere quieter, somewhere the cameras wouldn't catch everything, somewhere he could be dealt with without witnesses. He didn't move, didn't even blink. "Funny," he said, his voice even. "Didn't think I was due for an upgrade." Foster smirked, stepping closer, his grip tightening on the baton. "I don't ask questions, pal. I just follow orders. Now, let's go." Ethan had two choices. He could fight here, in this tiny cell, and take his chances against the guards that would swarm in the second he threw a punch. Or he could play along, see where they were taking him, and find a way to turn the situation in his favor. He exhaled slowly and nodded. "Lead the way." The walk down the corridor was slow, each step filled with the weight of anticipation. Other inmates watched from behind their bars, some with curiosity, others with the kind of knowing looks that made his skin prickle. They had seen this before, a prisoner being led somewhere they wouldn't be coming back from. Ethan kept his shoulders squared, his breathing steady. Whatever happened next, he would be ready for it. They turned a corner, moving past the main holding area into a dimly lit wing of the prison. The air here was different, stale, thick with the scent of damp concrete and something metallic. Foster led him to a heavy steel door, stopping just outside. "End of the line," the guard said, reaching for the keys at his belt. Ethan's mind raced. This was it. He had maybe 3 seconds to act before whatever was waiting for him on the other side of that door got the jump on him. He shifted his weight subtly, testing the tension in his muscles, preparing. The second the key turned in the lock, he moved. He spun, grabbing Foster's wrist before he could react, twisting hard enough to make the guard grunt in pain. The baton clattered to the floor, and Ethan wasted no time driving his knee into Foster's stomach. The man doubled over, wheezing, but Ethan didn't let up. He slammed the guard against the wall, one hand gripping the collar of his uniform, the other pressing just enough against his throat to keep him from making too much noise. "Who sent you?" Ethan hissed, his breath coming hard and fast. "Was it Lawson?" Foster tried to wrench himself free, but Ethan applied more pressure. The guard's face turned red, his eyes darting wildly down the hallway, searching for help that wouldn't come fast enough. "You're dead anyway," Foster spat. "They want you gone, Hayes. Doesn't matter how. You're not walking out of this place." Ethan's grip tightened for a moment before he shoved the man back, sending him sprawling onto the floor. He grabbed the baton and took a step back, his mind already working through his next move. He needed to disappear before backup arrived, needed to find a way out. But escaping from a maximum security prison wasn't exactly an easy task, especially not when half the guards were in on it. He turned, scanning the corridor for any sign of an opening, and then he saw it, a maintenance hatch near the floor, half concealed behind a stack of crates. If he could get inside, navigate through the maintenance tunnels, maybe. A distant shout rang through the hallway. They were coming. Ethan didn't hesitate. He sprinted for the hatch, dropping onto his hands and knees and wrenching it open. The space beyond was tight, dark, barely big enough for him to squeeze through, but it was better than waiting to be executed. He shoved himself inside, pulling the hatch shut just as the sound of boots thundered into the corridor. He held his breath, listening. "Where the hell is he?" one of the guards shouted. Foster groaned. He jumped me. Went that way." A pause, then the sound of movement, of men spreading out, searching. Ethan waited, counted the seconds in his head. Then, when he was sure the coast was clear, he started crawling. He didn't know where this tunnel led, didn't know if it was a way out or just another dead end. But one thing was certain, they had just made a mistake. Because now, Ethan Hayes wasn't just a man waiting for justice. He was a man on the run, And he wasn't stopping until he took every last one of them down. The tunnel was tighter than Ethan had expected, the metal walls pressing against his shoulders as he crawled forward in the near darkness. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the faint echo of voices above, guards shouting, their footsteps pounding against the concrete floors as they searched for him. His muscles burned with each movement, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had minutes, maybe less, before they figured out where he had gone, and if they caught him now, there wouldn't be a second chance. His mind was already working through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. He needed a way out of this prison, but without a plan, without resources. Escaping was a death sentence in itself. No phone, no allies, no Juno. The thought of his partner sent a sharp pain through his chest, but he forced it away. He had to focus. The tunnel stretched ahead of him, branching off in different directions. He hesitated for only a second before choosing the left path, his gut telling him it led somewhere other than another locked room. The air grew damp, the scent of rust and mildew thick, and the distant sound of water dripping echoed through the narrow space. He was moving downward. That was a good sign. It meant he was heading away from the main prison structure. The further he could get from the general population cells, the better. He reached a grated vent ahead, pausing as he pressed his ear to the metal. Silence. No voices. No movement. He gritted his teeth and braced himself before kicking at the vent with as much force as he could. In the cramped space, the metal groaned but didn't give. He kicked again, harder this time, and with a final sharp snap, the grate fell forward, clattering onto the floor below. Ethan peered through the opening. A maintenance storage room. The shelves were stocked with industrial cleaning supplies, buckets, and scattered tools. More importantly, there was a door. He dropped down from the tunnel, landing in a crouch, ears straining for any sign that someone had heard the noise. Nothing yet. Moving quickly, he scanned the room, his fingers brushing over the metal surface of a wrench before grabbing it. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. He tried the door. Locked, of course. He exhaled sharply, glancing around for an alternative. There a window, small and reinforced, but not impossible. He moved toward it, inspecting the frame, then turned back to the shelves, grabbing a crowbar from a toolbox. A sharp knock at the door made his breath catch. "You sure you heard something?" a voice asked on the other side. "Yeah," another voice muttered. "Might have been a rat, though. Places crawling with them. Better check." The doorknob rattled. Ethan acted fast. He jammed the crowbar under the window frame and pried with everything he had. The glass didn't shatter. It wasn't standard glass, but reinforced plexi. But the frame groaned, screws loosening, metal bending. Another sharp yank, and the whole panel popped free just as the lock on the door clicked. He didn't wait. He shoved himself through the gap, twisting his body to fit, and tumbled out into the open air. The rush of fresh oxygen hit him like a slap. The night was cool, the sky a deep, endless black above him, broken only by the faint glow of prison floodlights in the distance. He wasn't free yet. He was still inside the perimeter, still on their radar. But he was outside the walls. That was something. He had maybe 2 minutes before they raised the alarm. Less if the guards weren't idiots. He forced himself into motion, sprinting toward the outer fencing. Razor wire coiled along the top, glinting under the harsh artificial lights. Climbing would be suicide. He needed another way. His gaze flicked to the watchtower. A single guard inside, half distracted, his rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. Ethan crouched low, moving along the shadows of the building, searching for anything that could get him past the fence. Then he saw it. A supply truck, parked just outside a loading bay, engine idling. His heart pounded as he changed course, moving fast and low. If he could get inside, if he could stow away in the back, he might just have a chance. The voices behind him grew louder. The shouts had started. They knew he was gone. He had seconds now. He darted forward, reaching the truck just as a guard stepped around the corner. Ethan didn't hesitate. He swung the wrench, catching the man in the temple. The guard crumpled without a sound, and Ethan barely caught him before he hit the ground. His stomach turned at the weight of the unconscious body in his hands, but he shoved the guilt down. He didn't have time for it. He climbed onto the truck's rear bumper, slipping into the cargo area just as the driver's door slammed. The vehicle rumbled forward, and Ethan pressed himself against the wall, hidden beneath a stack of crates. His pulse hammered in his ears as the truck approached the main gate. If they stopped it, if they checked, if they even suspected. His grip on the wrench tightened. But then the gate groaned open. The truck rolled forward. No alarms, no shouts, no sudden gunfire. And then they were outside. Ethan didn't move, didn't breathe. He waited, counted the seconds. 1 minute, 2, 5. Finally, when the truck slowed at a stop sign outside the industrial district, he moved. Slipping out the back, he hit the pavement running, ducking into the shadows of an alley before anyone could see him. He was out, but he wasn't safe. Lawson, Shaw, Harrington. They had tried to bury him once. They had tried to kill him. And now they would come harder. He needed to move fast. He needed to get to Natalie. Because this wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about taking them all down. The night swallowed Ethan as he moved through the city, his heart hammering in his chest, his muscles screaming from the non-stop tension of survival. He kept to the shadows, ducking behind parked cars and slipping through alleys. Every instinct honed from years on the force screaming at him to stay unseen. The prison break would be all over the news by now. Every cop, every federal agent, every corrupt officer with something to lose would be hunting for him. But he wasn't just running anymore. He was hunting too. And he had a target. Lawson, Shaw, Harrington. They thought they had buried him. They thought the walls of a cell would silence him forever. But they had underestimated one thing. He still had a score to settle. He pulled the hood of a discarded sweatshirt over his head, keeping his face down as he crossed a deserted intersection. The city pulsed around him, neon lights flickering in bar windows, the distant wail of sirens, the hum of a world that had already moved on without him. But he wasn't invisible. Somewhere, someone would recognize him. He needed to move fast. He needed to get to Natalie. She was the only one he trusted, the only one who had believed in him even when the system had turned its back. If she still had the recording, if she had been able to stay ahead of them, then there was still a chance to take them down. He made it to her apartment just before dawn, slipping through the back alley entrance and pressing himself against the wall. His breath came fast, his pulse loud in his ears. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more, the signal they had used on stakeouts. A long silence followed. Then the door cracked open, and a pair of sharp, wary eyes met his. Natalie yanked him inside, locking the door behind them. "Jesus, Ethan," she hissed, stepping back to look at him. "You actually did it. You got out." Ethan exhaled, the weight of the last 24 hours pressing hard on his shoulders. "Had some help from a couple of incompetent guards," he said dryly. "Do you have it?" Natalie nodded and moved toward the kitchen, retrieving a small USB drive from a hollowed-out coffee can. "The recording is all here. I made copies, but they're watching me. I had to ditch my phone. They must have figured out I was onto them." Ethan took the drive, gripping it tight. "Then we don't have much time. We need to go public before they shut this down for good." Natalie hesitated, arms crossed, studying him. "Ethan, they'll come for you. If we take this to the press, if we expose them, you won't just be a fugitive. You'll be a target. You already are." Ethan's jaw clenched, the memories of the courtroom, the prison, the betrayal all crashing over him like a wave. "They already took everything from me. My career, my freedom. They tried to take my life. I'm not running anymore, Nat. I'm finishing this." She nodded slowly, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. Then she grabbed her coat. "Then let's move. I know a reporter who's clean. She won't back down, no matter how much heat comes her way." They left through the back entrance, slipping into the early morning haze. The streets were starting to wake, people moving like ghosts in the dim light, unaware that the city they lived in was rotting from the inside out. Ethan kept his hood up, his head down, following Natalie as she led him through a maze of back streets until they reached an old diner, just off 5th Street. Inside, a woman sat at a booth, her dark eyes scanning the room with the sharpness of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. "You're late," she said as they slid into the booth across from her. "Traffic," Natalie said dryly, handing over the USB. This has everything you need. Corruption in the department, fabricated evidence, and enough proof to bury a sitting senator. The reporter arched an eyebrow. That's a big claim. Ethan leaned in, his voice low, steady. It's not a claim. It's the truth, and it's about to become your biggest story. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll need time to verify it. But if this is as big as you say, I'll have it running by tonight. Ethan exhaled. That was all they needed. One headline, one broadcast, and the world would see the truth. But before they could move, before they could even stand, the doors to the diner swung open. Lawson. He walked in like he owned the place, his expression cool, unreadable. But his eyes locked onto Ethan like a predator sizing up its kill. Behind him, two men in suits flanked his sides, their hands hovering near their weapons. The message was clear. They weren't here to talk. Ethan didn't wait. He grabbed Natalie's wrist and pulled her down just as the first shot shattered the diner window. People screamed. The reporter dove under the table, clutching the USB. Ethan flipped the table for cover, reaching for the knife from the napkin dispenser, his only weapon. Lawson took another step forward, his voice calm, steady. You should have stayed buried, Hayes. Ethan's grip on the knife tightened. And you should have covered your tracks better. Another shot rang out, but this time it wasn't from Lawson's men. The bullet struck the nearest gunman in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. A growl ripped through the air, low, feral, familiar. Juno. The German shepherd lunged, knocking the second gunman to the floor. Ethan barely had time to register her presence before he was moving, his knife slashing. Catching Lawson across the arm, the older man grunted in pain, stumbling back. Natalie fired another shot, hitting the remaining gunman in the leg. Chaos erupted. The diner's patrons ran, screaming, as the fight tore through the space. Lawson staggered toward the door, clutching his wounded arm, his face twisted in fury. This isn't over, he spat before shoving through the exit, disappearing into the streets. Ethan didn't chase him. He knew this was bigger than just one man. He turned to Natalie, who was breathing hard, gun still in hand. The reporter, shaken but steady, clutched the USB. You still want to run this story? Ethan asked. She swallowed hard, then nodded. More than ever. Juno pressed against Ethan's leg, her fur bristling, her eyes sharp as ever. He dropped to one knee, running a hand over her head. Good girl, he murmured. She had found him. She had come for him, just like she always did. Natalie exhaled, shaking her head. Well, we're officially outlaws now. Ethan smiled for the first time in what felt like years. Not for long, because by the time the sun set, the truth would be out. And this time, the corrupt wouldn't be the ones writing the ending.